February 1945, Western Germany. The snow had melted into thick brown slush that clung to boots and wheels alike. For weeks, American infantry divisions had clawed their way through hedgerows, farm fields, and mine-strewn villages along the Siegfried Line, Hitler's last fortified barrier before the heart of the Reich. It was a place meant to drain the fight from any man who dared approach, and for the most part, it succeeded. But not everyone who stood in its shadow wore a uniform. In a battered farmhouse near the village of Niederzier, not far from the crumbling pillboxes and dragon's teeth of the German defense line, lived a man the locals called Old Hans. 57, wiry, and quiet. Hans Meyer had been a farmer long before the war and had no desire to be anything else. The war had taken his livestock, his sons, and his faith in flags. What it hadn't taken was his hatred for the black uniformed SS troops who had commandeered his fields and hanged 2 neighbors in his orchard. They called it requisition. He called it occupation. Hans had watched silently from his barn as convoy after convoy of SS trucks rolled past his land, bringing reinforcements and munitions to the crumbling Western Front. The Americans were coming, the whole village knew it. But while most civilians huddled in cellars, praying to be ignored, Hans kept thinking about those trucks. The same ones that had brought the men who executed his friend Lucas with a piano wire for hiding Allied airmen in his stable. It wasn't revenge Hans wanted. It was interruption. And what he had hidden under a haystack next to a rusted milk churn was the beginning of a terrible idea. A rusted pitchfork, 2 British landmines from the 1940 retreat, and an intimate knowledge of the SS's daily logistics schedule. Hans wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even a resistance fighter. But he was a man who had shoveled cow manure for 40 years and could read the terrain like a book. He knew exactly where the convoy slowed to a crawl right past the culvert beneath the southbound road where spring floods had eaten away the soil. Trucks always bunched there, engines downshifted. That's where it had to happen. The only problem? He had no real explosives knowledge, but he had a knack for improvisation and a fury that no training manual could replicate. Late one night, under a moonless sky, Hans lugged the 2 stolen S-mine casings out from where he'd hidden them years ago. One was partially rusted through, the other still held promise. Using wires scavenged from an old fence and glass bottles as insulators, he began cobbling together what could barely be described as a circuit. It was crude, unstable, and perfect. The pitchfork part came later. With the help of his niece Greta, a nurse who had seen enough wounds to recognize what shrapnel could do, they fused the broken tines of the pitchfork to the front of the mine like bayonets. Then Hans sharpened the tips with a file until they could punch through tire rubber and truck armor. Greta watched, worried. "If this goes off early," she warned, "they won't find enough of you to bury." Hans only grunted. "Then I'll finally be useful." The next morning, the farmer rose before dawn and wheeled his rickety cart up the muddy slope to the roadside culvert. He moved like a man sowing seeds, only this time he was planting a different kind of harvest. And the road that cursed SS artery was about to find itself cut. Der 1. März 1945. The Siegfried Line, near Niederzier. The fog was thick, like soup stirred too slowly. It blanketed the road in a deathly hush, muffling engine clatter, boot steps, even the distant artillery to the west. For the Waffen-SS convoy rolling east along the muddy road through Hans Meyer's farm, it was just another morning on the collapsing Western Front. 12 trucks, all painted in fading feldgrau. Their loads varied ammunition, fuel drums, and what the German officers called retreat logistics. That meant whatever the Wehrmacht could salvage before the Allies rolled over it. Documents, prisoners, wounded, food, anything of value. The men riding atop the trucks were veterans. Bloodied in the Ardennes, burned at Hurtgen, disillusioned but still dangerous. Among them was Oberfeldwebel Dieter Strauss, a man whose personal count of partisans executed in France earned him a cold respect from his peers and a quiet fear from his subordinates. Strauss was smoking his morning cigarette when the lead truck dipped into the soft shoulder of the road near the culvert, precisely the dip Hans Meyer had spent nights studying through frost-covered glass. Strauss didn't notice the glint of metal buried in the mud. Nor did the driver, half asleep from morphine and nerves, guiding the vehicle across the eroded shoulder. They did notice the click, but by then it was too late. A shriek of twisted metal split the air as the Pitchfork mine erupted beneath the truck's undercarriage. Shrapnel, pitchfork tines, rusted bolts, copper wire, and bits of a milk churn sliced through the air at 3,000 feet per second. The explosion didn't just disable the lead vehicle, it turned it into a fireball. The cab disintegrated. The fuel drums in the bed ignited instantly, sending a mushroom of flame 30 feet into the air. Black smoke punched into the fog, revealing the full column to anyone watching, including Hans, crouched behind a wall of hay bales 3 fields away, holding a rusted pair of binoculars. The second truck slammed on its brakes, skidding sideways and colliding with a third. The rest of the column froze. Chaos exploded faster than the bomb had. SS soldiers leapt from the beds, firing into empty fields. One screamed about partisans. Another yelled to set up an MG-42. The drivers were shouting over each other in half-mad panic. These were not elite commandos anymore. They were hunted men on broken wheels. Then came the secondary blast. Hans had rigged a second device further down the culvert, just in case the lead explosion didn't halt the column. When a retreating soldier stepped onto the roadside ditch, the buried mine detonated, blowing him 20 feet into the air and shearing the leg off the man next to him. What happened next wasn't a firefight. It was slaughter not by bullets, but by confusion. 2 trucks backed into each other trying to escape the narrow path. Another tipped into the embankment. Ammunition inside caught fire. The detonations rolled across the valley like thunder. Inside the farmhouse, Greta watched through a cracked window, her mouth trembling. "He actually did it," she whispered. "He's killing them with farm tools." In less than 10 minutes, the entire column was burning. 25 SS soldiers were dead. 5 more crawled through the mud, screaming. The rest fled toward the tree line, some leaving behind rifles, others their own boots. Oberfeldwebel Strauss? He was found days later in a crater, clutching a charred map and the melted remains of a Luger pistol. His entire convoy, trucks, supplies, fuel, ammo lost to what German intelligence later described as an unorthodox explosive trap, possibly laid by partisans. But there were no partisans. There was only Hans, a farmer with a pitchfork and a grudge, watching from the hills as the iron fist of the SS was shredded not by tanks or air raids, but by the very soil they had tried to conquer. The 3rd of March 1945. 2 days after the ambush, the blackened wrecks still smoked by the roadside when the next German unit arrived. Not a convoy this time, but a detachment of SS field police escorted by armored cars. They were not here to transport supplies. They were here to punish. The ambush at Niederzier had shocked the regional command. Not because a supply column was destroyed, those were happening daily in early 1945, but because of how it happened. 25 SS men, killed by a homemade mine, constructed from farm scrap. There were no witnesses, no gunfire, no captured enemy, no glory. Just fire, wreckage, and a single set of footprints in the frost leading back into the Meyer property. Major Gerhard Kleist, commander of the Einsatzkompanie, stood over the crater where the first Pitchfork mine had gone off. His coat flapped in the wind, and his leather gloves were black with soot as he sifted through the debris. "Unacceptable," he growled. "An entire convoy. Gone. By a peasant." He looked up slowly toward the distant farmhouse on the ridge, the one that hadn't burned like the rest of the valley. Through his binoculars, he saw a chicken coop, a woodpile, laundry frozen stiff on a line. Ordinary, quiet, too quiet. That evening, just after sunset, the SS arrived at Hans Meyer's home. Greta had seen the smoke trail of their half-tracks long before they reached the door. She had begged Hans to run. He refused. His hands were covered in grease, still smelling of wire and fertilizer. "I won't run from them," he said simply. "Not on my own soil." Greta slapped him, hard. "Then you'll die on it." By the time the boots pounded on the wooden porch, Greta had hidden their daughter in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. Hans stood at the door with dirt on his trousers and a weathered coat over his shoulders, like just another war-weary farmer. But the eyes of the men who came for him were not fooled. "You're Meyer," Major Kleist said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Hans answered. "You know what happened on that road. I heard explosions, saw smoke. You know what caused it. I imagine you'd know better than me, Major." The slap came faster than Greta could scream. Hans staggered sideways but did not fall. "We found copper wiring, cut from your fence," Kleist hissed. "Pitchfork tines matching your barn equipment, even the same size milk churns in your shed." Hans wiped blood from his lip and said nothing. Kleist smiled, a thin, razor-sharp thing. "If you won't talk, your neighbors will." By nightfall, the SS had swept through 3 farms. They dragged men from their beds, shot 2 dogs, and beat an elderly farmer half to death in front of his grandchildren. In the town square of Niederzier, they lined up 10 villagers and threatened to hang one for every day the saboteur remained unidentified. "No one talks?" Kleist shouted to the assembled crowd. "Then everyone suffers." That's when Greta stepped forward. She was shaking, not from fear, from rage. She held a piece of burned cloth in her hands. One of the SS uniforms Hans had scavenged from the wreckage and hidden beneath the chicken coop. "This was left on our land," she lied. "He didn't want to say anything, but I found it. Maybe it was partisans, maybe a deserter, but it wasn't us." Kleist snatched the cloth. His eyes narrowed. His mouth twitched. He wanted to shoot her. He didn't, because even Kleist knew the war was slipping away, and every bullet wasted on a civilian was one not used on the front lines. So he holstered his pistol and spat at the ground. "If I find out you're lying, Frau Meyer." "I'm already living with a liar," she said coldly. "Try me." He left that night, but not without ordering a final punishment. At dawn, the SS returned and burned down 3 barns in the valley, including the one belonging to the Meyers. Smoke spiraled into the sky like a funeral pyre. Livestock screamed. Chickens burst into flames in their coops. The smell of scorched straw and diesel choked the air. Hans watched it all without speaking. No one in the village turned him in. Not one voice. Because every man in that valley had once held a rifle. Every woman had buried someone they loved. And now, for the first time in years, they had seen one of their own strike back, not with speeches, but with flame and steel. And though the cost was high, the valley whispered a new kind of legend. A farmer who turned his pitchfork into a weapon of war. The 10th of March, 1945, just behind the Siegfried Line. The wind carried more than smoke across the war-torn valleys of Western Germany. It carried whispers. Whispers of an impossible ambush. Of a convoy of 25 SS trucks, obliterated not by Allied artillery or sabotage teams, but by a single German farmer. A man who buried explosives in pitchforks and milk churns, who struck at the heart of the Reich and vanished like smoke. The Allies didn't know his name, but his legend had a face. A farmer with bloodied hands, soot on his cheeks, and no flag in his heart. Radio operators in the British 8th Corps were the first to intercept the chatter. French resistance fighters near Metz spoke of a ghost saboteur who had halted an SS supply line for 2 full days. American infantrymen huddled in wet foxholes passed the story along like gospel, swapping out the farmer's pitchfork for a revolver, a crossbow, a scythe. Every version was different, but one detail never changed. 1 man, 1 explosion, 25 wrecks. A week after the attack, an Allied scout team operating near the Meuse River picked up a civilian broadcast from Radio Luxembourg, a coded message smuggled in by resistance riders. "To the farmer who fights with fire, the world sees you. The Reich bleeds from its own soil." The Americans played it back 3 times. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" asked Corporal Levin. "It means," said Lieutenant Avery, smiling grimly, "that even the Germans are turning." Back in London, at Bletchley Park, the name Niederzier appeared in decoded Wehrmacht communications, a redacted report about a missing SS convoy, sabotage investigations, and internal enemy action suspected within rural sectors. Winston Churchill, briefed on the incident by Allied intelligence, allegedly paused mid-scotch and muttered, "God save the farmer with a grudge." Meanwhile, in villages along the Rhine, the effect was electric. German civilians half-starved, bombed out, bitter from years of sacrifice, clung to the story like a spark in winter. Some didn't believe it. Others whispered prayers for the unknown man who dared to strike back. A retired coal miner in Essen scrawled the words, "Pitchfork Man Lives" on the wall of a ration hall. A teenage boy in Koblenz told his friends he'd seen the saboteur riding a motorcycle through the hills, dropping dynamite from a basket. A baker in Aachen swore her cousin knew a friend of the man's wife, and that the farmer had once been a soldier who deserted after the Battle of Stalingrad. They gave him names he never chose. Der Spukbauer, the ghost farmer, der brennende Knecht, the burning servant. None of them were true, but they were powerful. Even within the German army, morale began to fray. Some conscripts, shaken and cold, took the story as a sign that even civilians had turned against the Nazi war machine. SS officers in the western districts issued new orders. Search all farms, interrogate suspected collaborators, report any use of agricultural equipment as sabotage material. In one bitter twist, a panzer mechanic in Remagen was court-martialed for joking that maybe they should all grab pitchforks and head home. He was flogged publicly, but the crowd was silent. No jeers, no cheers, just silence and unspoken agreement. But far away from the rumors and myth-making, Hans Meyer was back to work. His barn was gone, his livestock decimated. His hands were cracked from rebuilding his chicken coop with salvaged wood. The SS had taken his tools. His neighbors offered him food in secret. His daughter brought him nails in her small palms, watching him work without asking questions. At night, Hans sat on the hillside overlooking the wreckage he had caused. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a ghost. He felt tired, numb. But he wasn't done. A week after the first ambush, Hans placed another mine on the northern road, a single churn buried beneath frost-covered brush. It destroyed an armored car, killed 2 officers, and collapsed a fuel truck into a ditch. This time, the Wehrmacht blamed partisans. But they were wrong. It wasn't an army. It wasn't a cell. It wasn't a movement. It was a farmer with nothing left to lose. April 1945, the woods outside Düren, Germany. Beneath the twilight sky, a man in muddy boots walked through ash and frost, dragging a splintered shovel behind him like a blade. His name was Hans Meyer, once a soldier, now a ghost in his own land. The Reich had branded men like him traitors, cowards. But Hans didn't run from war. He had seen too much of it. He ran from slaughter. 3 years earlier, in the frozen hell of Stalingrad, Hans had been part of the 6th Army, a conscript. A farmer turned infantryman thrown into the meat grinder. He had dug trenches into permafrost with bare hands, watched boys freeze to death with rifles still clutched to their chests. On Christmas Eve 1942, he saw a captain shoot a fellow German soldier in the head for trying to eat snow from a bloodied helmet. "Discipline," the captain had barked. That night, Hans buried 2 men with a stolen spoon and vowed to God that if he lived, he would never again lift a weapon for anyone but his own. When Polis surrendered and the remnants of the army were crushed, Hans was lucky wounded early, evacuated and sent back west. He arrived in Bavaria thinner than a scarecrow, half his teeth gone from starvation, and was declared unsuitable for reassignment. So they sent him home. But home no longer existed. Niederzier was a changed village by 1943. Bomb craters dotted the fields. The church bell tower was gone. Ration lines wrapped around half-burned bakeries. And worst of all, the Reich had come in full uniform. The SS patrolled the countryside, not to protect, but to purge. They hunted deserters, interrogated clergy, and seized livestock under the guise of supporting the front. Hans kept his head down. He worked his small patch of land, raised his daughter alone, buried his wife quietly after a bombing raid. He didn't protest. He didn't resist, until the day the SS came for his neighbor. Herr Fischer was 70, a World War I veteran who walked with a cane and had once taught Hans how to repair a plow. They said he was hiding leaflets Allied propaganda. Hans saw them drag Fischer into the snow, beat him until the cane snapped in half, then leave him bloodied on his porch. He died the next morning. No trial, no burial, just a corpse and silence. That was the moment something broke in Hans. Not with rage, but with clarity. The war had taken everything from him, his brothers at Stalingrad, his wife in the raids, his dignity under the boots of men in black uniforms. And still, he remained quiet. Until that day. That night, Hans retrieved a crate of unused munitions buried in the barn floor, not Reich-issued. Soviet leftovers, relics of a broken front and broken promises. He had carried them home on a train under his coat, years ago, thinking he'd never use them. But war forgets nothing. He crafted his first weapon in the same spot he once mended saddles. He stuffed TNT into an old milk churn, welded spikes from scrap iron, and sealed the cap with tar. He buried it beneath a bend in the road where the SS convoys routinely passed the route they used to collect donations from terrified villagers. He didn't pray. He didn't boast. He just walked home. And the next morning, 25 SS trucks were nothing but twisted wreckage. The Gestapo called it an act of partisan terror. The Wehrmacht called it an internal security breach. But the people? They called it justice. Whispers spread that the saboteur had once fought at Stalingrad, that he had stared death in the face and walked away without blinking. Children in the village secretly carved SS killer into fence posts. Teenagers passing by Hans' small homestead stopped to nod quietly. No one spoke. But they knew. Even his own daughter began to understand. She found soot on his sleeves, mud in his boots at midnight, and once a torn patch of canvas that reeked of cordite hidden behind the stove, but she never said a word. Neither did Hans. By May 1945, the Allies were advancing fast. The Siegfried Line was collapsing. But deep in the forest, Hans Meyer kept planting bombs, one churn at a time. Not for glory, not for country, but for the old man with a cane, for the boys left behind in Russian snow, for the motherless child sleeping in his arms, for every lie the Reich had ever told. April 1945. 2 days after the explosion, the twisted metal of 25 SS trucks still smoldered at the bend in the road when the black uniformed reinforcements arrived. Their boots crunched over shattered glass and scorched earth. A lieutenant climbed down from an armored scout car, surveyed the wreckage, and swore under his breath. This wasn't sabotage, he muttered. It was a message. He wasn't wrong, but the message hadn't been written in leaflets or paint. It had been carved with shrapnel-crude, jagged punctuation at the end of a long silence. A silence Germany's forgotten villages had kept for too long. And now, that silence was burning. Hans Meyer stood in his field that morning, pitchfork in hand, sweat streaking down his spine beneath his shirt. From a distance, he watched the column of SS vehicles approach Niederzier again, but slower this time, more cautious. They weren't here to extort potatoes. They were here to find the ghost who had struck them. To punish, to remind the people who still ruled. Hans didn't flinch. He kept digging. But this time, it wasn't for planting. The lieutenant's men fanned out through the village like a black tide. They forced open doors, overturned hay carts, lined up farmhands with rifles at their backs. In the village square, children huddled behind carts while women clutched bread baskets like shields. But no one talked. One SS man kicked over a barrel of cabbage. Another ripped a crucifix from a wall. The lieutenant barked, "If he is not handed over, 10 of you will hang by morning." But the villagers had seen what real monsters looked like and what courage sounded like in an explosion of flame and metal. Still, Hans knew silence wouldn't save them forever. He had one more field left to till. That night, beneath the crescent moon, Hans moved again. He wore his dead brother's coat, stuffed with wool and dirt, to simulate a man's shape. In one pocket, a bait note scrawled in charcoal. "For every house you raid, another truck burns." In the other, a torn patch of SS insignia, taken from the rubble. He laid the decoy body beside a collapsed stone wall, in clear view of the road. Then he stepped off the path, vanished into the thickets, and waited. At dawn, the SS returned. They moved with bayonets raised, their dogs snarling, sweat slicking their faces in the growing heat. One spotted the coat. "Halt!" They rushed forward, weapons aimed. But there was no blood, no breathing, just straw and cloth. And before the lieutenant could curse, a whine rose beneath his feet. Click! A pitchfork, welded with pressure plates and wrapped in anti-tank charges, detonated beneath the mock corpse, not enough to blow a building, but perfectly shaped to annihilate a circle of men. The shock wave cracked ribs. Shards of iron teeth tore through the search party. 8 men died instantly. A 9th bled out in the mud, trying to scream through a throat full of smoke. The blast echoed through the forest like thunder. Hans didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He just packed the last of his tools and disappeared into the woods again. By dusk, word had reached the nearby Wehrmacht garrison. Another SS patrol obliterated, this time on foot. The official report labeled it a partisan ambush. But in the taverns of nearby towns, the whispers grew louder. The farmer did it again. He buried the pitchfork like a landmine. They say he walks at night, planting death where the boots march. Hans Meyer had become something more than a saboteur. He was myth now. To some, a ghost. To others, justice in the shape of a man. Back in the village, the lieutenant's replacement was a quieter man. He didn't threaten to hang anyone. He didn't raid homes. He posted a notice on the church wall in clipped German. Cooperation will be rewarded. Resistance will be forgotten. This is your only warning. But the people said nothing. They only stared. And Hans? He was already in the next village, standing in the stables of a bombed-out farm, hammering nails into a milk can filled with gravel, gunpowder, and a broken rake handle. Another harvest. Another reckoning. April 1945. Aachen-Sektor. Siegfried Line. The war was crumbling at the edges. To the west, American columns thundered through breached bunkers, crossing minefields with bulldozers and flame. To the east, the Soviets were storming Berlin's suburbs. But in the heart of Germany's fortress line, something else was happening. Something stranger. German officers began whispering the same name in mess halls and field briefings. The Pitchfork Ghost. It began as rumor. A farmer, nameless, faceless, was planting bombs like seeds across the Siegfried Line. Not military demolitions, not resistance cells. Crude, impossible traps fashioned from rakes, lanterns, plow parts, and bones. The stories spread fast. A convoy vaporized outside Stolberg by what turned out to be a wine barrel filled with coal dust and rusted nails. An SS captain's staff car flipped end over end by a bed frame packed with lye and fuel hidden beneath a child's wagon. A pillbox reduced to rubble by a hay bale wired to an old Allied shell casing, timed to ignite when the wind turned. The methods didn't make sense. But the results? Terrifying. By the second week of April, 8 incidents had been reported. Then 12, then 23. None could be traced to a known resistance group. No patterns, no trails. Only the calling card. A bent pitchfork, left standing in the ruins. Hans Meyer, the quiet farmer from Niederzier, had become something he never intended, a ghost with a legend. He moved through the forests at night, guided only by moonlight and memory. By day, he hid in root cellars, haylofts, the bell tower of a burnt church where owls nested among broken rafters. He didn't carry a gun, only wire, nails, tools. Each day, he built something new. A false crate of carrots with phosphorus buried beneath. A pressure plate disguised as a floor tile in an abandoned checkpoint. A church pew, hollowed out and packed with fuel oil. He didn't target civilians. Never touched children, clergy, or medics. His fury was surgical. He hunted SS. Specifically, the trucks, officers, and vehicles that carried the black uniformed remnants of Hitler's private army. The same men who had executed farmers, who had dragged village elders from their homes, who had burned his brother's orchard to the roots. And each time he struck, he left no trace. Except the pitchfork. Among Allied soldiers, the rumors trickled in from local interpreters and POWs. There's a farmer who fights the SS alone. They call him the Scarecrow of the West Wall. He's not with the Wehrmacht, not with the resistance, just a man who won't stop. An American captain in the 104th Infantry Division, after watching a gutted German convoy on a muddy road, reportedly muttered, "I don't know who did that, but I hope he's on our side." Back in a crumbling SS command post outside Bitburg, panic was growing. Major Dietrich, a brutal officer with hands red from reprisals, reviewed the casualty reports. 3 trucks lost near Düren. Stavka destroyed near Heimbach. 2 officers wounded in a stable explosion near Langerway. Each report ended the same way. No enemy sighted. Suspect, local sabotage. Signs point to same method. Crude explosives, hidden triggers, pitchfork insignia. Major Dietrich slammed his fist on the table. This isn't sabotage, he growled. This is humiliation. He ordered mass arrests. 15 villagers were hanged in retaliation. But the attacks didn't stop. If anything, they escalated. The next morning, a rail car carrying SS medical supplies erupted into a column of fire. The cause: a forged brake lever connected to a pocket watch timer. The pitchfork was left stabbed into the railroad ties. Hans, meanwhile, was exhausted. His hands bled. His back ached. He hadn't spoken aloud in days. But the look in the eyes of those SS survivors, wild, hunted, afraid, was worth every bruise. For once, they felt what his people had felt for years: powerlessness. One night, hiding in a ravine beneath a collapsed bridge, Hans wrote 5 words into the dirt beside his bedroll. Even monsters fear the plow. By April 20th, Hitler's final birthday, the pitchfork ghost was being officially hunted. A bounty was placed. Leaflets dropped over towns, rewards offered. But no one betrayed him. How could they? Hans wasn't just one man anymore. He was a symbol, the last revenge of the soil itself. The 26th of April, 1945. Western edge of the Siegfried Line. Rain fell in sheets across the ravaged countryside, beating down charred hedgerows and washing blood from the rutted roads. A scout jeep from the U.S. 102nd Infantry Division crawled past a burned-out panzer turret, its headlights flickering through the fog. Corporal Louis Herrera, riding shotgun, muttered, "You smell that?" Private Rourke beside him nodded. Cordite and cow manure. They rounded a bend and froze. In the middle of the road stood a man, shirt torn, hat low, face streaked with mud. He held a shovel in one hand, a pitchfork in the other. The jeep jerked to a halt. Herrera raised his rifle. "Halt! Hände hoch!" But the man didn't flinch. Slowly, he dropped the pitchfork, raised his hands, then said something in accented English. "You are 3 hours too late." Rourke blinked. What the hell? Behind the man, barely visible through the fog, a collapsed convoy of SS vehicles, still smoldering. 8 trucks, 2 motorcycles. A Kubelwagen flipped on its side. Craters burned into the dirt like craters from hell. The soldier in front of them, farmer's boots, soot-covered face, eyes dark and tired, gestured to the ruins. "I planted them myself. They came at dawn. I waited." Herrera stared. "You did this?" The man nodded. "I am Hans Meyer. I was a farmer. Now I farm graves." They brought Hans to the command post near Euskirchen. Colonel Braxton, a Texan with whiskey breath and a Purple Heart ribbon, didn't know what to make of him. "What is he, OSS?" "No, sire. Civilian." "He do this himself?" "Sir, he's booby-trapped an entire swath of countryside. They're calling him the Pitchfork Ghost." The colonel narrowed his eyes. "I want to talk to him." They brought Hans into the tent. Braxton asked the first question plainly. "Why?" Hans answered slowly. "Because they came to my home, took my brother, shot him in front of our goats, burned the barn, laughed as we screamed. So I gave them something to fear." Braxton exhaled. "You fought them without orders?" Hans didn't blink. "They gave the orders. I gave the consequences." Word spread quickly through the American ranks. Not about the sabotage, they'd seen enough explosions, but about the man. He slept in a barn, didn't eat meat, and carried a necklace made of scrap metal pieces, each one etched with a date and a location. One sergeant asked him if he believed in God. Hans looked him dead in the eyes and said, "I believe in earth, fire, and memory. God can come later." That night, a lieutenant from the engineering corps followed Hans into the woods. What he saw changed him. Hans showed him how he built his devices, not with blueprints, but by intuition. A pressure mine under a porcelain plate. A Molotov triggered by a balance scale. A pitchfork welded with bearings to create directional shrapnel. "War is not complicated," Hans said, "but it should be personal." The next morning, the lieutenant returned and wrote a 3-page report titled, Asymmetrical Tactics from Non-Affiliated German Civilian Operative. The subtitle? Highly effective, highly emotional. Hans refused medals. He refused a uniform. When asked if he wanted to come to America after the war, he replied, "I will rebuild my house. The land needs hands." But before the lines moved east, he helped the Americans one last time. He led a small squad through a forest near Zulpich, pointed out every trap he'd laid, every spot where an ambush could be hidden. By the end of the day, they'd cleared 6 kilometers without a single casualty. When they reached a small farmhouse, he turned to them. "Beyond here, the ghosts are German again. You won't need me." Then he vanished into the woods. A month later, as Germany surrendered, an American chaplain passing through Niedersee stopped at a house rebuilt with salvaged timber. Inside was a man with blistered hands, hammering planks into a new barn door. The chaplain asked, "Are you the Pitchfork ghost?" Hans looked up. "No," he said. "I'm just a farmer again." The 8th of May, 1945. VE Day. In towns across Europe, bells rang. Crowds wept. Flags unfurled from shattered windows. But on a ruined plot of farmland near the Siegfried Line, there was only silence. Hans Meyer stood alone, boots sinking into the wet spring soil. He did not cheer. He did not cry. He simply pressed his hand into the earth where his brother had been buried, no grave marker, just a dented Wehrmacht helmet repurposed as a headstone. He whispered one word, "Fertig," finished. But for Hans, the war was never truly over. The Americans tried to find him again. A few weeks after the German surrender, a U.S. intelligence officer named Lieutenant Avery returned to the area with orders to locate the Pitchfork ghost. There were rumors in OSS circles now, rumors that Hans's sabotage techniques could be useful in future operations. But when Avery arrived in the village, the locals shrugged. Hans had disappeared again. Some said he was rebuilding the house brick by brick. Others said he'd been seen helping bury bodies in nearby villages where mass graves had been discovered. One story claimed he took in a group of orphan children and taught them to plant potatoes with military precision. No one knew for sure. What was certain was this: every mine Hans had built, he had personally deactivated. Every field he had rigged, he had walked barefoot through before spring planting. Not for the Americans, not for Berlin, but for peace. Allied files, redacted, forgotten, feared. In declassified files from 1952, Hans Meyer's name appears in a short report by the U.S. Psychological Warfare Division. Unaligned saboteur, no confirmed political affiliation, untrained, high morale impact. Targets, exclusively SS and supply convoys. Techniques mimic partisan warfare, but demonstrate rural mechanical ingenuity. Suggest monitoring, but there were no follow-up files. Hans did not join any post-war intelligence unit. He didn't sell his methods or write a book. He simply returned to the soil. The village rebuilds. By 1947, the village of Niedersee had built a new school and a simple stone memorial to the war dead. Most people passed it without looking. There was no plaque for Hans, and yet everyone remembered. Children played near his fields, but never stepped too far in. Out of superstition, out of respect. Their parents had told them strange stories. That's where the ghost lives, the one who feeds the land with fire, but plants his vengeance gently. Some nights, villagers swore they saw him walking the perimeter at dusk, coat flapping in the wind, a pitchfork still in hand. A visit from a former enemy. In the summer of 1950, a man in civilian clothes arrived at Hans's farm. He had once been an SS truck driver, the only survivor of the convoy destroyed by Hans's mines. He didn't come for revenge. He came with a question. "Why didn't you shoot me?" Hans didn't look up from the carrots he was harvesting. "You weren't worth a bullet," he said plainly. But then, unexpectedly, he added, "You have children?" The man nodded. "2. Hans handed him a bundle of carrots. "Feed them. Do better." That was all. The soap, the helmet, and the pitchfork. Hans kept 3 relics from the war. A bar of American-issue soap, cracked and dry. His brother's helmet, rusting but whole. And the pitchfork, its tines bent, its wooden shaft scorched near the base. He never told anyone why he kept them. But one visiting journalist in 1961 wrote in her notebook, "Hans Meyer is not a hero. He is a wound that refused to rot, a man who chose not to become a monster in response to monsters. And in that refusal, he became legend." A quiet funeral. Hans Meyer died in 1973. No obituary, no headlines. Just a small cross placed beside the stone barn he rebuilt himself. At his funeral, attended by fewer than 20 people, an old man in an American overcoat approached the grave. It was Captain Braxton, now long retired. He took out a medal, an unissued bronze star, and placed it on the wooden coffin. "Never had the chance to pin this on you, Hans, but you wore something better dignity." He saluted once and left. The legend lives. Today, the story of the Pitchfork ghost lives in the margins of war history books. A footnote, a rumor, a tale told by German grandfathers to skeptical grandchildren. But in the archives of the 102nd Infantry Division, there's a single photograph. A man with a lined face, soot-smudged hands, standing beside a pile of scrap metal and one very dented SS convoy. No caption, just a handwritten note. The farmer who plowed the Reich. Fall 1993 Niederer, Germany. A young war historian named Jakob Lenz arrived in the village, chasing a ghost. He wasn't looking for a general or a politician, not a tank ace or resistance fighter. He was chasing rumors of a farmer, a pitchfork, and a convoy of dead SS trucks left smoldering in a forgotten field along the Siegfried Line. Jakob had come armed with a tape recorder, a few declassified Allied reports, and one grainy black and white photo showing a weathered man standing beside charred wreckage with soot on his cheeks and a bent farm tool in his grip. There was no name, no military record, just a scrawled note. The farmer who plowed the Reich. The villagers still remembered. Jakob knocked on doors, asked old men drinking beer in the shade, spoke to women tending backyard gardens. Some brushed him off. Others told stories. My uncle swore he watched the trucks go up from across the valley, said it sounded like thunder under the earth. My grandmother called him Der Geist vom Acker, the ghost of the field. Eventually, he was led to a retired schoolteacher, Frau Irma, who had taught in the village since 1946. She didn't speak much at first, but when Jakob showed her the photo, she smiled. "Hans Meyer," she said softly. "That was him. He saved us, not from the Americans, from the war itself." She opened a drawer and pulled out a small, cracked wooden box. Inside was a metal-less ribbon, a faded Red Cross letter, and a piece of rusted metal shaped like a pitchfork tine. "The field still stands." Jakob asked where it had happened. Frau Irma took him to the edge of the village, a patch of earth surrounded by hedgerows and crumbling fence posts. Sheep grazed nearby, but the ground strangely was uneven, as if something had erupted there long ago and the land never forgot. Jacob crouched, ran his fingers through the soil, still blackened in places, still dotted with tiny flecks of melted steel. He took a photograph. Later, he wrote in his journal, "I expected wreckage. What I found was memory planted like seed, quiet, unmarked, but deeply rooted." The American connection. Back in the U.S., Jakob reached out to surviving veterans of the 102nd Infantry Division. One name kept surfacing: Captain Emery Braxton. Retired in Texas, blind in one eye, 78 years old. Jakob called him. When he mentioned Hans, Braxton went silent for a long time. Then he said, "He did more with a pitchfork than I did with a full platoon." Braxton still had the handkerchief Hans gave him, still kept it folded in a drawer. He mailed it to Jakob with a note. "Tell his story. People remember generals, but I think mercy wins wars too." A memorial rises. In 1997, the village of Niederer unveiled a small memorial near the edge of that same field. It wasn't grand, just a stone carved with a single phrase. "Er pflügte nicht nur das Land, sondern auch das Gewissen der Zeit." He plowed not only the land, but the conscience of his time. Beneath it, a bronze sculpture of a pitchfork, bent and scorched. On the day of the unveiling, children from the local school recited stories collected from their grandparents. A few wept, a few laughed. At the back of the crowd stood an old American, cane in hand, Captain Braxton. When he was invited to speak, he simply said, he never asked for a statue, just soil soft enough to plant peace. Legacy beyond borders. Today, Hans Meyer's name rarely appears in textbooks. But in military ethics classes, his story is sometimes used as a case study. The Farmer's Code. A man with no uniform, no orders, no medals, who chose targets carefully, who spared when he could have slaughtered, who built weapons out of farm tools but never turned them on the helpless. He is proof that resistance doesn't always require an army. Sometimes, it just takes someone willing to defy both sides of madness. One last memory. In a recorded interview, a woman named Elise, once a prisoner of war who had worked nearby, shared her final memory of Hans. I once asked him why he never left, why he stayed in the ruins and kept planting potatoes in soil littered with shrapnel. He smiled and said, "If I leave, who will teach the soil to forget the war?" Fade to black. The screen fades out on a sweeping aerial shot of the field, lush green, rolling in the wind. Children laugh somewhere in the distance. A bird lands atop the memorial. And at the bottom of the screen, in quiet white text, "In memory of those who chose courage without cruelty."